The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red uniform jacket for the third time. He had been a palace guard for only 6 months, but already the weight of his responsibility felt heavier than the ceremonial sword at his side. The other guards whispered that he was too young, too eager, too willing to follow every rule to the letter. They weren't wrong. Thomas took his duty seriously because his father had died serving the royal family, and his mother had sacrificed everything to get him this position. Every morning he polished his boots until they gleamed, memorized the daily schedules, and studied the faces of everyone who entered and left the palace grounds. His supervisor, Captain Reynolds, had noticed his dedication and assigned him to the most sensitive areas of the palace. Today was different. Thomas had been assigned to patrol the East Wing, where Queen Camilla's private chambers were located. It was an honor that most guards waited years to receive, but it also came with strict instructions. No one was to disturb the Queen unless there was an emergency. No one was to enter her private rooms without direct permission. And absolutely no one was to speak about anything they might see or hear while on duty. As Thomas walked the long corridor lined with portraits of past royals, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was unusual. The normal sounds of the palace seemed muted today. Servants moved more quietly than usual, and even the other guards appeared tense. He had heard whispers in the guard quarters about strange visitors and secret meetings, but he had dismissed them as gossip. The afternoon brought an unexpected change in routine. Thomas was told to remain at his post longer than usual because Queen Camilla had requested extended privacy. He stood at attention outside her chambers, his eyes fixed straight ahead, when he heard something that made his blood run cold. Voices were coming from inside the room, but they weren't the usual sounds of royal business. Queen Camilla was laughing in a way he had never heard before. It was soft, intimate, and entirely different from her public persona. But what troubled him more was the second voice responding to her laughter. It was definitely a man's voice, but it wasn't King Charles. Thomas knew the king's voice well from official ceremonies and private briefings. This voice was younger, warmer, and spoke with an accent that suggested he wasn't from England. Thomas tried to focus on his duty and ignore what he was hearing, but the conversation became impossible to dismiss. The unknown man was calling Queen Camilla by her first name, something that even close family members rarely did in private. He heard the rustling of fabric, the soft sound of footsteps moving closer together, and then a silence that seemed to stretch forever. His training told him to remain at his post and report nothing unless it threatened the royal family's safety, but his conscience told him that what he was witnessing might be exactly that kind of threat. If Queen Camilla was having a secret meeting with someone who shouldn't be there, it could create a scandal that would rock the monarchy. The weight of this knowledge felt heavier than his ceremonial armor. As the sun began to set, casting the corridor in golden light, Thomas heard the voices again. This time they were making plans to meet again tomorrow at the same time. The man mentioned something about being careful and avoiding the main entrances. Queen Camilla assured him that she had taken precautions and that their secret was safe. Thomas realized he was no longer just a guard observing unusual behavior. He was now a witness to something that could change everything. When his shift finally ended, Thomas walked back to the guard quarters with his mind racing. He had always believed that serving the royal family meant protecting them from outside threats. He had never considered that sometimes the threat might come from within. The other guards greeted him normally, asking about his first day protecting the Queen's chambers, but Thomas could barely respond. He felt like he was carrying a secret that was too big for him to handle alone. That night, Thomas lay in his narrow bed in the guard quarters, staring at the ceiling. He thought about his father, who had died protecting the royal family's secrets. He thought about his mother, who had worked 3 jobs to help him get this position. And he thought about his oath to serve and protect the crown, even when that duty became complicated and painful. The next morning would bring new challenges, and Thomas knew he would have to make a decision that could affect not just his career, but the future of the monarchy itself. As he finally drifted off to sleep, he could still hear Queen Camilla's laughter echoing in his mind, along with the voice of the mysterious man who had somehow found his way into the most secure part of the palace. Thomas woke before dawn, his sleep troubled by dreams of angry kings and disappointed mothers. The guard quarters were still quiet, but he could hear the distant sounds of the palace beginning to stir. Kitchen staff would already be preparing breakfast, and the cleaning crews would be making their silent rounds through the corridors. He dressed carefully, his movements automatic after months of practice, but his mind was elsewhere. During breakfast with the other guards, Thomas struggled to act normally. His fellow guards talked about football matches and weekend plans, their voices cheerful and unconcerned. They had no idea that one of their own was carrying knowledge that could shake the foundations of the royal family. Thomas pushed his food around his plate, his appetite gone, while trying to convince himself that he had misunderstood what he had heard the day before. Captain Reynolds appeared in the doorway of the dining hall, his stern face scanning the room until his eyes found Thomas. He approached with the measured steps of a military man, his boots clicking against the stone floor. Thomas felt his heart rate increase as the captain stopped beside his table, but Reynolds simply handed him a folded piece of paper with his assignment for the day. East Wing again. Queen Camilla's chambers. Same post, same responsibility, same impossible situation. As Thomas made his way through the palace corridors, he noticed details he had missed before. Security cameras were positioned at regular intervals, but there were blind spots near service entrances and staff passages. The palace was designed to be elegant and welcoming, not to be a fortress, and someone who knew the building well could move through it without being detected by the main security systems. He took his position outside Queen Camilla's chambers with a growing sense of dread. The morning passed normally, with servants bringing tea and correspondence, secretaries delivering documents for review, and the usual flow of royal business. Thomas began to hope that the previous day had been an isolated incident, perhaps a misunderstanding or a perfectly innocent meeting that he had misinterpreted. Just after lunch, everything changed. A man approached from the direction of the service corridors, walking with the confident stride of someone who belonged in the palace. He was tall and handsome, probably in his early 40s, with dark hair and olive skin that suggested Mediterranean heritage. He wore expensive clothes that were casual but elegant, the kind of outfit that would allow him to blend in with wealthy visitors or minor nobility. Thomas stepped forward to intercept him, following protocol for anyone approaching the Queen's private chambers. But before he could speak, the man smiled and produced a small card from his jacket pocket. It was a visitor's pass, properly signed and dated, that gave him permission to meet with Queen Camilla for a private consultation about art acquisitions. Thomas examined the pass carefully, checking the signature and official seals, and found nothing wrong with it. The man waited patiently while Thomas verified his credentials, his demeanor calm and professional. He introduced himself as Marco Santini, an art dealer from Italy who specialized in Renaissance paintings. His accent matched the voice Thomas had heard the day before, but in this context it seemed perfectly appropriate. Queen Camilla was known to be interested in art, and private consultations with dealers were not unusual. Thomas knocked on the chamber door and announced the visitor. Queen Camilla's voice called for them to enter, and Thomas opened the door to allow Marco inside. As the door closed behind them, Thomas resumed his position in the corridor, but his mind was far from peaceful. The interaction had seemed completely normal and professional, which made him question everything he thought he had witnessed the day before. Minutes passed in silence, and then Thomas heard the voices again. At first, they discussed paintings and galleries. Their conversation focused on business matters. Marco described pieces from private collections, and Queen Camilla asked detailed questions about provenance and pricing. Thomas felt relief washing over him as he realized he had probably misunderstood the situation entirely. But then the conversation changed. The formal tone disappeared, replaced by something much more personal. Queen Camilla asked about Marco's family, his life in Italy, his feelings about returning to England. Marco spoke about missing her when he was away, about thinking of her during long evenings in his gallery, about the difficulty of maintaining their friendship given her position and responsibilities. Thomas felt his worst fears being confirmed as the voices became softer, more intimate. There were long pauses in the conversation, filled with sounds he couldn't identify but could easily imagine. When Queen Camilla laughed again, it was the same warm, private sound he had heard the day before, completely different from her public persona. Marco responded with endearments in Italian, words that Thomas didn't understand but that clearly weren't appropriate for a business meeting. The young guard found himself in an impossible position. His duty was to protect the royal family, but what exactly did that mean in this situation? Was Queen Camilla in danger from this man? Or was she making choices that could endanger the monarchy itself? Thomas had no training for this kind of moral complexity, no guidance from his superiors about how to handle secrets that could destroy reputations and end marriages. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas realized that the relationship between Queen Camilla and Marco was not a recent development. They spoke with the familiarity of people who had known each other for a long time, who had shared many conversations and experiences. Marco mentioned previous visits, gifts he had brought her, and plans they had made together. This was not a casual flirtation or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was an ongoing relationship that had been hidden from everyone else in the palace. When Marco finally emerged from the chambers, he nodded politely to Thomas before disappearing back down the service corridor. Queen Camilla remained in her rooms, and Thomas could hear her moving around, perhaps putting things away or returning the room to its normal state. He stood at his post, feeling like the weight of the entire monarchy was resting on his shoulders, knowing that tomorrow would bring the same impossible choices and the same burden of unwanted knowledge. 3 days passed with Marco visiting Queen Camilla's chambers each afternoon, and Thomas felt like he was living in two different worlds. During his off-duty hours, he tried to be a normal young man, talking with other guards about sports and movies, calling his mother to assure her that his job was going well, and attempting to sleep peacefully in his narrow bed. But during his shifts in the East Wing, he became an unwilling keeper of secrets that grew more dangerous with each passing day. Thomas had started keeping a mental record of everything he observed. Marco always arrived through the service corridors, suggesting he knew the palace layout well enough to avoid the main security checkpoints. His visitor passes were always perfectly legitimate, indicating that someone with significant authority was helping to arrange these meetings. The conversations between Marco and Queen Camilla had become increasingly personal, with references to shared memories and future plans that clearly extended beyond any professional relationship. On Thursday afternoon, everything changed in a way that Thomas could never have anticipated. He was at his usual post when he heard raised voices from inside Queen Camilla's chambers. At first, he thought perhaps she was having a business disagreement with Marco, but as the voices grew louder, he realized that King Charles had arrived unexpectedly and discovered Marco's presence. Thomas heard the king's voice, stern and demanding, asking who Marco was and why he was in the queen's private chambers. Queen Camilla's response was calm but strained, as she tried to explain that Marco was an art consultant helping her with acquisitions for the royal collection. The king's voice grew more suspicious as he questioned why these consultations required such privacy and why he had not been informed about them. Marco attempted to maintain the professional pretense, introducing himself and explaining his credentials as an art dealer, but King Charles was not convinced. Thomas could hear the tension in the room escalating as the king demanded to see documentation of the supposed art transactions and questioned why Marco had been visiting so frequently, without any paintings actually being purchased. The confrontation that followed was devastating to witness, even from outside the closed door. King Charles accused Queen Camilla of deception and demanded the truth about her relationship with Marco. Queen Camilla initially tried to maintain her story, but under pressure from her husband's questions, her composure began to crack. Marco attempted to defend her, which only made the situation worse by confirming that their relationship was indeed more than professional. Thomas stood frozen at his post, unsure whether he should intervene or retreat. His training told him to protect the royal family, but in this case the threat seemed to be coming from within the family itself. He could hear Queen Camilla beginning to cry, her voice breaking as she tried to explain her feelings and her actions. King Charles' voice remained cold and controlled, but Thomas could detect the pain and anger beneath his formal tone. The argument revealed details that Thomas wished he had never heard. Queen Camilla admitted that she had known Marco for over 2 years, that their relationship had begun as a professional consultation, but had gradually become something much more personal. She spoke about feeling lonely and misunderstood, about finding in Marco someone who appreciated her for herself rather than for her title. King Charles responded with accusations of betrayal and questions about how long the deception had been going on. Marco tried to take responsibility, explaining that he had never intended for their friendship to become complicated, that he had tried to maintain appropriate boundaries but had failed. He offered to leave immediately and never return, but King Charles was not interested in simple solutions. The king demanded to know how many people were aware of these meetings, how Marco had gained access to the private chambers, and whether there were any security risks that needed to be addressed. As the confrontation continued, Thomas realized that his own position was becoming increasingly precarious. As the guard assigned to protect Queen Camilla's chambers, he would inevitably be questioned about what he had observed. He would be asked whether he had seen anything suspicious, whether he had followed proper protocols, and whether he had reported anything unusual to his superiors. The truth was that he had seen everything but had reported nothing, making him complicit in the deception. The voices inside the chamber grew quieter as the initial shock and anger gave way to a more serious discussion about consequences and next steps. King Charles spoke about the potential impact on the monarchy, the risk of scandal if the situation became public, and the need to handle the matter with absolute discretion. Queen Camilla agreed to end all contact with Marco immediately, while Marco promised to leave England and never speak about what had happened. When Marco finally emerged from the chambers, his face was pale and his usual confidence had disappeared completely. He walked past Thomas without making eye contact, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Thomas could hear Queen Camilla sobbing quietly inside her chambers, while King Charles spoke in low, serious tones, presumably about damage control and future precautions. As Thomas continued his watch outside the chambers, he realized that witnessing this confrontation had changed everything. He was no longer just a guard who had accidentally discovered a secret. He was now a potential witness to a scandal that could affect the future of the royal family. The question was no longer whether he should report what he had seen, but whether anyone would believe his version of events and whether speaking up would help or harm the people he had sworn to protect. That evening, as Thomas finally ended his shift and walked back to the guard quarters, he felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and he suspected that his role in this unfolding drama was far from over. The next morning brought an emergency meeting that Thomas had been dreading since the confrontation in Queen Camilla's chambers. Captain Reynolds summoned him to his office immediately after breakfast, his expression grave and his usual military bearing even more rigid than normal. Thomas knocked on the office door with a trembling hand, knowing that his career and possibly his future were about to be decided in the next few minutes. Captain Reynolds' office was spartanly decorated with military honors and official photographs, a reminder of the serious nature of palace security. The captain sat behind his desk, reviewing a thick file that Thomas assumed contained his service record and recent assignments. Without looking up, Reynolds gestured for Thomas to sit in the chair across from his desk, then continued reading in silence for what felt like an eternity. When the captain finally spoke, his voice was measured and professional, but Thomas detected an undertone of disappointment that cut deeper than any anger could have. Reynolds explained that there had been a security incident in the East Wing, and that all guards who had been assigned to that area were being questioned to determine whether proper protocols had been followed. He asked Thomas to provide a detailed account of everything he had observed during his recent shifts guarding Queen Camilla's chambers. Thomas faced the most difficult decision of his life. He could tell the complete truth about everything he had witnessed, which would confirm that he had been aware of the inappropriate meetings, but had failed to report them. Or he could lie and claim that he had observed nothing unusual, which would protect him from disciplinary action, but would also mean covering up a situation that could threaten the monarchy. Either choice seemed like a betrayal of his duty and his conscience. He chose a middle path that he hoped would satisfy his obligation to honesty without causing unnecessary damage. Thomas reported that he had observed unusual visitor patterns and had heard conversations that seemed more personal than professional, but that the visitor had always presented proper credentials and that Queen Camilla had never appeared to be in any danger. He emphasized that he had followed protocols by checking visitor passes and maintaining his post as instructed. Captain Reynolds listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but never changing his expression. When Thomas finished his account, the captain asked several pointed questions about specific dates and times, about the identity of the visitor, and about why Thomas had not reported his concerns earlier. Thomas answered as honestly as he could while trying to minimize the damage to everyone involved, including himself. The captain then revealed information that shocked Thomas and made him realize how much more complicated the situation had become. Security cameras in the corridor had malfunctioned during several of Marco's visits, suggesting that someone with technical knowledge had deliberately disabled them. Additionally, the visitor passes that Marco had been using were legitimate, but had been issued under false pretenses, indicating that someone within the palace administration was involved in facilitating the secret meetings. Reynolds explained that a full investigation was being conducted to determine how the security breaches had occurred and who was responsible for them. Thomas would be suspended from duty pending the completion of this investigation, and he would be required to sign confidentiality agreements that would prevent him from discussing anything he had observed with anyone outside the investigation team. His future employment with the palace would depend on the results of the investigation and his cooperation with the inquiry. As Thomas left Captain Reynolds' office, his head spinning from the implications of what he had learned, he realized that the situation was far more serious than a simple romantic indiscretion. The involvement of multiple people in facilitating Marco's visit suggested a conspiracy that could have security implications beyond the personal scandal. Someone had been willing to compromise palace security to help Queen Camilla maintain her secret relationship, and that person was still unknown and potentially dangerous. Returning to his quarters, Thomas found that his belongings had already been moved to a different room, one that was typically used for guards who were under investigation or awaiting reassignment. The other guards looked at him with curiosity and concern, but the confidentiality agreements he had signed prevented him from explaining what was happening. He felt completely isolated, cut off from his colleagues and uncertain about his future. Over the following days, Thomas was interviewed repeatedly by different officials, each asking variations of the same questions about what he had seen and heard. Internal security specialists wanted to know about technical details like camera positions and communication systems. Senior palace administrators were concerned about breaches in visitor protocols and the integrity of official documentation. Even representatives from the royal household asked about the personal dynamics they had observed and the potential for blackmail or other security threats. Through these interviews, Thomas began to understand the full scope of the investigation. Marco Santini was not just an art dealer who had become romantically involved with Queen Camilla. He was being investigated for possible connections to foreign intelligence services, and his frequent access to the palace was now seen as a potential espionage risk. The seemingly innocent romantic affair was being treated as a matter of national security. Thomas also learned that Queen Camilla had been completely cooperative with the investigation, providing detailed information about her relationship with Marco and accepting full responsibility for her actions. She had agreed to additional security measures and restrictions on her private activities, and she had voluntarily submitted to questioning by security specialists. King Charles had also been interviewed and had provided his own account of discovering the situation. As the investigation continued, Thomas found himself in the strange position of knowing more about the royal family's private lives than many of their closest advisors. The interviews had revealed details about the loneliness and pressures that had led Queen Camilla to seek companionship outside her marriage, the sophisticated methods that had been used to arrange the secret meetings, and the potential consequences if the situation became public knowledge. The weight of this knowledge, combined with his uncertain future and isolation from his colleagues, began to take a serious toll on Thomas's mental health. He had entered palace service believing that protecting the royal family would be a straightforward matter of following orders and maintaining security protocols. Instead, he had discovered that sometimes protecting the monarchy meant keeping secrets that could destroy it, and that loyalty could require choices that felt like betrayal. 2 weeks into the investigation, Thomas received an unexpected visitor in his temporary quarters. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the Queen's private secretary and one of the most powerful people in the palace hierarchy, knocked on his door early one morning when most of the other guards were still asleep. She was an elegant woman in her 60s, known for her discretion and her fierce loyalty to the royal family, and her presence in the guard quarters was highly unusual. Lady Margaret invited Thomas to join her for a private walk in the palace gardens, away from the surveillance cameras and listening devices that were everywhere inside the building. As they strolled through the perfectly manicured flower beds, she spoke quietly about the investigation and its potential consequences. Thomas listened in growing amazement as she revealed details about the situation that he had never suspected. The relationship between Queen Camilla and Marco had indeed lasted for over 2 years, but it had not been purely romantic as Thomas had assumed. Marco was actually working as an intermediary for several European art collectors who were interested in acquiring pieces from the royal collection. Queen Camilla had been meeting with him to discuss potential sales that could help fund various charitable projects. But these transactions required absolute secrecy because they involved items that were considered national treasures. Lady Margaret explained that the personal relationship between Queen Camilla and Marco had developed gradually as they worked together on these sensitive financial matters. The Queen had found herself attracted to his intelligence and passion for art, while Marco had been genuinely moved by her commitment to charitable work. Neither of them had intended for their professional relationship to become personal, but the secrecy required for their business dealings had created an intimacy that eventually crossed appropriate boundaries. The security breaches that had allowed Marco to visit the palace undetected were not the result of a conspiracy, but rather of a well-intentioned effort to protect the confidentiality of the art transactions. Lady Margaret herself had arranged for the disabled cameras and the false visitor credentials, believing that she was protecting legitimate royal business from unnecessary scrutiny. She had not realized that the relationship between Queen Camilla and Marco had become inappropriate, until King Charles discovered them together. Thomas felt a mix of relief and confusion as Lady Margaret continued her explanation. The investigation had cleared Marco of any espionage connections, and the security concerns had been resolved once the true nature of his visits was understood. However, the personal aspect of the relationship remained a serious problem that could create scandal if it became public knowledge. The royal family needed to find a way to address the situation without destroying reputations or damaging the monarchy's credibility. Lady Margaret then revealed why she had sought out Thomas for this private conversation. The investigation had concluded that Thomas had acted appropriately throughout the entire situation, following protocols and reporting his observations when questioned. However, his position as a witness to the Queen's private moments made him a potential security risk if he were to remain in palace service. The administration was considering transferring him to a different position or possibly ending his employment altogether. But Lady Margaret had a different proposal. She explained that the royal family valued Thomas's discretion and professionalism, and they wanted to offer him an opportunity that would benefit both him and the monarchy. They were prepared to fund his education at a prestigious university, where he could study international relations or security studies, with the understanding that he would return to serve the royal family in a higher capacity after completing his degree. This offer came with conditions that Thomas would need to consider carefully. He would be required to sign additional confidentiality agreements that would legally bind him, never to discuss what he had witnessed during his time guarding Queen Camilla's chambers. He would also need to accept that his knowledge of the situation made him a permanent part of the royal family's inner circle, with all the privileges and responsibilities that entailed. Thomas asked about Queen Camilla's future and whether the investigation would affect her position in the royal family. Lady Margaret's response was measured but reassuring. The Queen had accepted full responsibility for her actions and had agreed to additional oversight of her private activities. The relationship with Marco had ended completely, and steps had been taken to ensure that similar situations would not occur in the future. King Charles had been hurt by the situation, but was committed to working through the problems in their marriage with the help of counselors and advisors. As they concluded their walk through the gardens, Lady Margaret emphasized that Thomas's decision about the university offer would need to be made quickly. The royal family wanted to move forward from this difficult period, and that required ensuring that all loose ends were tied up appropriately. Thomas would have 24 hours to decide whether to accept their offer or to pursue other options for his future. That evening, Thomas sat in his temporary quarters thinking about the choice he faced. The university education would provide him with opportunities he had never dreamed of, and the chance to serve the royal family in a higher capacity was an honor that most people would never receive. But accepting the offer would also mean accepting permanent responsibility for keeping secrets that could affect the future of the monarchy. He thought about his father, who had died serving the royal family, and his mother, who had sacrificed everything to help him achieve his current position. He thought about his oath to serve and protect the crown, and what that oath meant when serving and protecting required difficult choices and moral compromises. Most of all, he thought about Queen Camilla, who had made mistakes but who was also a human being dealing with loneliness and pressure that most people could never understand. As Thomas prepared for sleep, he realized that his decision would determine not just his own future, but also his role in protecting a family and an institution that were far more complicated and fragile than he had ever imagined. Tomorrow would bring the need for a final choice, and whatever he decided would change his life forever. Thomas spent a sleepless night weighing his options, and by dawn he had made his decision. He would accept the university offer, but first he wanted to speak with Queen Camilla directly. This request was highly unusual, as guards were not typically granted private audiences with members of the royal family, but Lady Margaret agreed to arrange a brief meeting, given the extraordinary circumstances of the situation. The meeting took place in a small sitting room in the East Wing, the same area where Thomas had spent so many hours standing guard and unwillingly learning royal secrets. Queen Camilla arrived precisely on time, dressed simply but elegantly, her demeanor calm despite the obvious strain of recent events. Thomas had seen her many times from a distance during his duties, but this was his first opportunity to speak with her directly and to see her as a person rather than as the distant figure he was sworn to protect. Queen Camilla thanked Thomas for his service and his discretion, acknowledging that he had been placed in an impossible situation through no fault of his own. She spoke candidly about her regrets regarding the relationship with Marco, explaining that she had never intended for their professional collaboration to become personal, and that she understood the security risks and embarrassment her actions had created for the royal family. Thomas was struck by her sincerity and vulnerability. The queen he had observed from outside her chambers had seemed confident and in control, but the woman sitting across from him now appeared genuinely remorseful and concerned about the consequences of her choices. She asked about his plans for the future and listened carefully as he explained his decision to accept the university opportunity while continuing his commitment to serve the royal family. Queen Camilla then shared something that surprised Thomas and helped him understand the broader context of what had happened. She explained that the pressures of royal life, particularly the constant scrutiny and limited privacy, had left her feeling isolated and desperate for genuine human connection. Marco had represented a chance to be appreciated for her intelligence and interests, rather than for her title, and she had gradually allowed appropriate boundaries to blur as their friendship deepened. She also revealed that the art transactions that had brought her and Marco together were part of a larger effort to modernize the royal family's approach to charitable fundraising. Traditional methods of raising money for royal charities were becoming less effective, and she had been exploring innovative approaches that required absolute secrecy until they could be properly implemented. The need for discretion in these financial matters had created the perfect cover for a personal relationship that should never have developed. Thomas asked about King Charles and how the royal couple was working to repair their marriage after this betrayal of trust. Queen Camilla's response was thoughtful and honest. She explained that King Charles had been deeply hurt by her deception, but that he understood the pressures that had contributed to her poor judgment. They were working with counselors to rebuild their relationship and to establish better communication about their individual needs and challenges. The Queen also addressed the impact on the monarchy's reputation and the measures being taken to prevent similar situations in the future. All private meetings with external consultants would now require additional oversight, and security protocols were being updated to eliminate the vulnerabilities that had allowed Marco's undetected visits. Most importantly, she and King Charles were committing to regular discussions about their relationship and any concerns that might arise. As their conversation continued, Thomas began to understand that his role in this situation had been more significant than he had realized. His discretion and professionalism had helped contain a scandal that could have seriously damaged the monarchy's credibility. By following protocols while also showing appropriate concern for the Queen's welfare, He had demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and loyalty that the royal family valued in their staff. Queen Camilla concluded their meeting by personally thanking Thomas for his service and expressing her confidence that he would represent the royal family well in his future role. She also made a request that touched him deeply. She asked him to remember that members of the royal family, despite their titles and privileges, were human beings who made mistakes and struggled with the same emotions and needs as everyone else. She hoped that his experience would help him serve with both professionalism and compassion as he advanced in his career. After Queen Camilla left the sitting room, Thomas remained for several minutes processing the conversation and its implications for his understanding of royal service. He had entered this situation believing that protecting the monarchy meant following rules and maintaining security protocols. He now understood that true service sometimes required making complex moral judgments and balancing competing loyalties while maintaining absolute discretion. That afternoon, Thomas formally accepted the university offer and signed the additional confidentiality agreements that would govern his future relationship with the royal family. Lady Margaret personally escorted him through the process and assured him that his education would be fully funded and that a position would be waiting for him upon graduation. She also provided him with contact information for mentors who would help guide his studies and prepare him for his eventual return to palace service. As Thomas prepared to leave the palace and begin the next chapter of his life, he realized that the events of the past few weeks had changed him in ways he was still discovering. He had learned that loyalty could require keeping secrets that were painful to bear, that protecting people sometimes meant protecting them from the consequences of their own mistakes, and that true service meant understanding the humanity of those he was sworn to protect. The young man who packed his belongings and said goodbye to his fellow guards was different. From the eager recruit who had arrived at the palace just months earlier, Thomas now carried knowledge and responsibility that would shape his entire future, and he understood that his brief time as a palace guard had prepared him for a lifetime of service that would be far more complex and demanding than he had ever imagined. 5 years later, Thomas stood in the same corridor where he had once served as a young palace guard, but now his role and perspective were completely different. He had completed his university degree with honors, studying international relations and constitutional law, and had returned to palace service as a senior advisor specializing in security and protocol. The education funded by the royal family had transformed him from a naive recruit into a sophisticated professional who understood the complex challenges facing modern monarchy. The palace had changed during his absence, with new security measures and updated protocols that reflected lessons learned from various incidents, including the situation with Queen Camilla and Marco Santini. Thomas had contributed to many of these improvements, using his unique understanding of both operational security and the human pressures that could compromise it. His recommendations had helped create systems that protected the royal family's privacy while maintaining appropriate oversight of their activities. Thomas often reflected on the events that had changed his life, particularly as he observed the current generation of young guards who patrolled the corridors with the same earnest dedication he had once shown. He had become a mentor to many of them, teaching not just security procedures but also the importance of discretion, judgment, and understanding the humanity of those they served. He never shared the specific details of his experience with Queen Camilla, but he used the lessons he had learned to help prepare others for the complex situations they might encounter. Queen Camilla and King Charles had successfully weathered the crisis in their marriage, emerging with a stronger relationship built on better communication and mutual understanding. Thomas had observed their interactions during official events and private meetings, and he could see the genuine affection and respect that had replaced the distance and formality that had once characterized their public appearances together. The counseling and commitment they had invested in their relationship had clearly paid dividends. The art charitable fundraising program that had originally brought Queen Camilla and Marco together had eventually been implemented successfully, but with much better oversight and transparency. The royal family had learned to balance the need for confidentiality in sensitive financial matters with the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries and security protocols. Thomas had played a role in developing these new procedures, ensuring that future charitable initiatives would not create similar vulnerabilities. Marco Santini had disappeared from their lives completely after the investigation concluded. Thomas had learned through unofficial channels that he had returned to Italy and had established a successful gallery in Florence, focusing on promoting young artists rather than dealing in high-value historical pieces. There had never been any suggestion that Marco had spoken publicly about his relationship with Queen Camilla, and Thomas suspected that he, like everyone else involved in the situation, had chosen to keep those memories private. Thomas's mother had been overjoyed by his university success and his advancement within the royal household, though she still didn't know the specific events that had led to these opportunities. She believed that his promotion had been based purely on his dedication and intelligence, and Thomas saw no reason to burden her with the more complicated truth. His father's legacy of loyal service to the royal family continued through Thomas's career, but in ways that his father could never have imagined. The young guards who now served in the East Wing followed updated protocols that included better communication systems, regular rotation of assignments, and clearer guidelines for reporting unusual situations. Thomas had helped develop these improvements, drawing on his experience to create procedures that would protect both the royal family and the guards who served them. He took satisfaction in knowing that future guards would be better prepared for complex situations than he had been. As senior advisor, Thomas attended regular briefings with members of the royal family, including Queen Camilla, who treated him with the respect and warmth appropriate for a trusted staff member. Their interactions were always professional, but Thomas occasionally detected a moment of recognition in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the shared experience that had shaped both of their futures. Neither of them ever referenced those difficult weeks directly, but both understood how those events had contributed to their current roles and relationships. King Charles had also benefited from the lessons learned during that challenging period. He had become more involved in understanding the pressures faced by all members of the royal family, and had worked to create better support systems for dealing with the isolation and scrutiny that came with their positions. Thomas had been consulted on several initiatives designed to help royal family members maintain appropriate social connections. While respecting security requirements, the broader royal household had evolved as well, with staff at all levels receiving better training on recognizing and addressing potential security risks, while respecting the privacy and dignity of the people they served. The culture of absolute silence that had once characterized palace service had been replaced with a more nuanced approach that encouraged appropriate communication while maintaining essential confidentiality. Thomas's story had become part of the institutional memory of the palace, though the specific details were known only to a very few people. His experience served as a case study in how to handle sensitive situations with discretion and judgment, and his subsequent success demonstrated the value of investing in staff development and education. The royal family's decision to support his university education, rather than simply dismissing him, had proven to be beneficial for everyone involved. As Thomas concluded another day of service to the royal family, walking through corridors that held so many memories and secrets, he felt grateful for the unexpected path his life had taken. The naive young guard who had accidentally discovered Queen Camilla's secret had become a sophisticated professional who understood that true service required wisdom, compassion, and the ability to see beyond simple rules to the complex human realities that shaped every situation. The palace would always hold secrets, and there would always be dedicated people like Thomas working to protect both those secrets and the people who carried them. His story was just one thread in the complex tapestry of royal service, but it was a thread that had helped strengthen the entire fabric through the lessons learned and the wisdom gained from navigating impossible choices with honor and integrity.